Everybody. Hello, everybody. A little pause for that technicality here on Skype, but hey, that's what we just talked about. Computer technology is getting tougher. It's not getting easier. It's not user friendly, especially with somebody who's supposed to be invisible at my age. So you're welcome to listen to this show. This is a great show. Mark Olly is my guest from the UK. Great guy, very talented. So we got a lot of interesting things in the first episode. This is the second episode. This is part two of the two books that he's covering. This is the Dave Emmons Show, and I'm glad everybody's here with us. And I thank you all for your support on Facebook and the other platforms that we go on. And Mark Olly, he's my guest today, and we had a wonderful chat on the first episode. And he's a nice chap. He's not a mate, he's a chap. He's from UK. He got me straight on that one. Okay. Mark Olly is an internationally recognized author, TV producer, presenter, writer, lecturer, broadcaster, musician, longtime musician, and he's got a band that's called, I think it's called the Copperworm Band, and they play rock music, got their own originals, and he's must be quite the drummer. He's still kicking it out there, and he's using double bass and everything. So he's playing some kick music. It looks like to me great for him and great for his band. It's got an album coming out this spring, and he's an archaeologist, and he works in the archaeological unit and runs a DVD production and props company, Myth Company, and he's a lecturer at Wilmslow Guild and the University of Chester. And that's where he heads up the archaeological unit. And he lives in Cheshire, UK. Great guy, great all-around guy, academia and also open-minded. And he's going to talk about the other book that he wants to do on the second part of this show. Mark Olly from the UK, could you tell me anything else about the intro that I should add?
Oh wow, I don't head up Chester. I'm a visiting lecturer in archaeology at Chester. It's an enormous facility. My unit's in Manchester. I have an archaeology unit over in Manchester.
Okay.
I'm shortly to become chairman of, so I've been a long-time member of that, about 40 odd years now, on and off. So yeah, that other than that, Mythco is my production company, the mythological company. Apart from that, everything else, I think you hit the nail on the head there, really.
Oh, you kind of elbow up to a lot of these big elites and these real intellectual people, right?
Well,
have you ever met the king and queen?
Oh no, I've never met the king and queen. No. I've met lots of famous people and quite a few intellectuals, but far too many to mention. I mean, I was professional in the music business for 21 years, so I met a huge number of people. It's when you do something like that, when you have a job like that, where you're actually doing that kind of work, where you sort of, I'm a drummer, I'm in behind the scenes, but at the same time, you're meeting all those people. When you do that sort of thing, you sort of put it in a box. So, it's either you're in that industry and you're inside the box, or you're outside of the industry, and then you kind of put the box on the shelf. It's the only way as human beings, I think, we can cope with that kind of contrast, or certainly it's the only way I cope with it as a contrast,
Well, maybe maybe the king will knight you as Sir Mark Olly.
After the book we're about to deal with, the King Arthur one, I think he's more likely to kick me out the front door. But
oh my goodness,
it's a radical book.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we covered the crystal skulls and human heads, the mystical history of glass, and the extinction of the world. We covered that in the first, episode, then which is going to be released Sunday. And here's the second book.
It's the second book.
Polychronicon
of Merlin, Joseph, and Arthur. Actually, is it better there? Yeah, you can see it better there. There we are.
Yeah, there you go. That's a nice, pretty cover too. I like the colors.
Yeah, it's hardback. This one, it's a little bit bigger than the other one. The other one's about 90 pages. This one's 488.
Ooh, so it's wow, that's some work.
This is the one to get if you can get it, by the way, because this is the hardback. And Philip Mantle, who's the publisher at Flying Disc Press, he says this is one of the best books he's ever done. One of his artists came up with this front cover based on the content of the book, and as a hardback, it's amazing. So well worth it. I think in English it's kind of about 23 quid. I don't know what that is in dollars, but certainly maybe between say $25 and $35 delivered. You'll get that from Amazon. just whatever it says on Amazon. But that is the subject of the talk we're about to do. Speaking of royalty, I mean, Arthur. Everybody's waiting for Arthur to return, and become King Arthur. Well, if King Charles gets sort of his what do they call it, coronation, if it goes according to plan, which I think it will do in May, one of his middle names is Arthur.
Really?
So that raises the question.
Well, see, you might be knighted before long.
Do we have King Arthur sat back on the throne of Britain? Yes, we do, because King Charles Charles III is actually King Arthur. His middle name is Arthur.
So history repeats itself.
Yeah, it does. I'll go on.
And we know Philip Mantle, the Flying Press. He's got your books. He's publishing them. He's a great guy. I've known him and I've had him on the show, talked to him before, and he's a really great guy. And I'm a UFO ET, I guess, phenomena experiencer. And you're saying in this book, the Polychronicon of Merlin, Joseph, and Arthur, and you're saying that this has nothing to do with ETs or UFOs. And why would Philip Mantle publish this book?
Yeah, there's a fabulous story behind that. I mean, I've got to say right at the beginning, it is a radical book. It is that's why I was joking about Charlie being not too happy about it, because it is quite radical. It does overturn some of the Arthurian preconceived ideas. So, Glastonbury, Tintagel, all that sort of thing, Stonehenge, they all go out the window, because that's not what this book is about. This is about the real King Arthur. So it's took 45 years to get this thing published. I started it in 1977. So it's a lifelong work, if you like. It started off as a film. Yeah, I made a movie about Arthur when I was in a cine society as a teenager, and it's gone from there. But I was struggling. I mean, I approached a lot of publishers with this through the sort of early 2000s, and a lot of the publishers were saying, this is too radical. We can't put this out. As academics, as academic publishers, as whatever, this is more than our career is worth. We can't put this out. So I'm sat there one day. I'd finished doing Crystal Skulls and Human Heads. And I'm sat there thinking, radical. You don't get much more radical than someone who publishes stuff on flying saucers. As soon as you think about flying saucers, you think, you've got secret stuff that they're releasing. They're looking at, military records. You're looking at stuff that's open to debate. You're looking at alternative science. You're looking at all the witnesses and the evidence and all this kind of thing. And I'm thinking, well, hang on a minute. King Arthur, that's not as radical as, say, Roswell, or any of the other major incidents that have happened in ufology. So I approached Philip and I just said, look, you're obviously not afraid to put the truth out there. You're not afraid to, to publish the real material. Why don't you have a bash at King Arthur? Now, his first reaction was exactly what everybody's reaction is. I don't do history or archaeology. It's just not my subject.
Different genre,
I did another interview with a lady on a radio station out of New Orleans, and I moaned about this. I was like, I'd love to do it with Philip. Plenty of reasons to do it with Philip. We need to do it with Philip. I described the book and we chatted about it, which we're going to do now. So, maybe folks will get an idea of where I'm coming from. Anyway, this lady is quite well known to Philip, and she apparently a few days later, she got on the blower to Philip and she was like, you've got to take this book, mate. You can't not take this book. Don't just look at it as history and archaeology. Forget that. There's stuff in there that is radical. It's groundbreaking. It's alternative. This could set the tone for the next millennium. I mean, if you look at Arthurian history, go back to Geoffrey of Monmouth and his History of the Kings of Britain. That was written in around about 1120, at the beginning of the 1100s. That started the whole Arthurian thing that we've got now, and it ran for 1,000 years. We've just gone past the millennium. It's about time somebody came out with a book that was as radical as Geoffrey's book. So what I've done is I've gone back to all the source material and everything we have available now and really pushed out there sort of an original view, if you like, of Arthur. So that's how it came about. It was partly me sort of approaching him and saying, look, you're obviously not afraid to put stuff out there that's edgy, that's going to, upset the establishment. And then, a couple of other people, including this lady who did this interview, kind of got onto Philip and said, look, don't miss out, 45 years to produce a book. Then this is the bit that I find really amusing, just to nail it. Because I'd done Crystal Skulls and Human Heads, of course, I had the format for Flying Disc Press, because he sends you the format, you know, to put the book into. Well, I already had the format, so I started work on the book. It took 55 hours. It took an entire weekend block to do it, but I built the entire book from scratch. So it had photos, it had all the proofreading done, it had the layout, it had everything. And I did it in the same style. So by the time it got to Philip, it was only missing the front cover. Oh. Now, how could he say no?
Yeah,
he couldn't possibly say no, could he? Really?
Yeah, I don't format my books. I mean, I do proofread them and edit, but you know,
I just did it. I just built the entire thing and sent it to him finished. And
that's a lot of work.
You know,
you deserve praise on that book. That's a lot of work after all those years. Also, now, Mark, have you ever went out on the sites where King Arthur is supposed to be and the sword is supposed to be? Have you ever?
Yeah. Now this is where it gets right down to the cutting edge, because at the end of the day, if you get back to the original material, you start looking at the oldest surviving sources. You go back beyond Geoffrey, so you're way back. I mean, Arthur lived between, you know, let's say 450 and 550. I think he's born in whatever it was, I think it's 489. He's born. He dies in 539, something like that. We've got the dates in the Welsh records, so we know that he's either side of 500. You know, within 100 years or so of his death, he was gradually becoming more and more famous, because he was never a king. He was always a warrior. He was a battle leader. So all the cultures that come after him, the Saxons, the Danes, the Vikings, all that, they're all into this warrior, you know, hero worship, like Beowulf and all that. And that's what happens to Arthur. He ends up going down that route. But you're looking at post-Roman Britain, and you're looking at Dark Age stuff, you know, which is difficult to deal with. But as soon as you get into that, you suddenly realise that actually there is quite a bit of material knocking around. And that's what this book does. It engineers it backwards. Well, once you do that, you can answer questions like, okay, when did he live? Where did he live? Which is really important. What did he actually do? What out of all the other stuff is nonsense? You know, what could he have not done in a million years? What's totally impossible? Get rid of all that.
Right.
You start to get down to reality. Well, the real kicker is he's mostly based in North Wales. So over here, as you say, you can go and stand, for example, on the archaeologically excavated remains of the villa where he was trained by Hector. When he was a teenager, he was actually trained at this Roman villa. They sent him there for training, and it actually exists. It's there on the shores of Bala Lake. You know where the sword was cast into the lake. Chances are it's Bala Lake. That's where it's gone. You can start searching for items like the Grail. You can start searching for, you know, the Giant's Dance, which is not Stonehenge at all. It's this monument that Merlin constructed to the death of the Welsh Britons under the hands of the Saxons. You know, you can start going looking for these sites when you've got an idea of what areas you're looking in. So, I mean, the book's great for doing that. I don't mince me words. You know, like I say, I demolish all the stuff that's medieval nonsense, all the rubbish that's been stuck onto the legend, and then I really get stuck in with the real sites. I do actually, or have done in the past, done an Arthurian tour where over a couple of days I will take people around all the sites in North Wales, and I'll show them. There's a very famous stone, for example, where he beheaded one of the rival chieftains, a guy called Whale. He cut this guy's head off, and physically that stone still exists. You know, it's in the square in the village of Ruthin, and you can go to it. You can literally put your hand in the middle of it. That's the closest you're ever going to get to a point where Arthur stood, and his sword will have come down, it will have struck that stone, and you're actually putting your hand in the spot where that sword came down. You can literally get that close, and that's what the book covers. So it's,
Mark, how did the sword come down? Did it lodge itself in the stone and somebody pulled it out?
The sword's not there anymore, but you can look at the stone, because somebody was beheaded on it. It's a beheading stone for cutting somebody's head off. But you can imagine if this sword came whizzing down, you know, whoosh through this guy's neck, it'll have gone whoosh, ching, it'll have hit the stone, and he's pulled it back out, and the stone which the story centers around is still there. So you're really getting very close. You're getting really, really close. I know where Camelot is. I know where the Round Table was. I know where Joseph of Arimathea is potentially buried. I know where King Arthur had his own hill fort. Avalon, it identifies Avalon. It gives a couple of potential sites for the burial of Arthur's remains. It's a book that doesn't mess around. It will tell you what you need to know. And because it says Polychronicon, that's the clue. That title, it's a chronological history of Merlin, Joseph, and Arthur. So it runs like a diary, and it has this beautiful effect of giving you the information you need, but your understanding develops from the beginning of the story through all the data, through all the information, right the way through to the end. So by the time you get to the end, actually, you know a tremendous amount about the history and about how Arthur became Arthur and how these different characters influenced that story, how they came about. That was the idea of doing it that way. The original idea came from a medieval monk that used to live in Chester in about 1320. He wrote the original Polychronicon, which was a history of the world. I'm not going to try and do that. That's a bit too big a project.
Yeah, we're talking to Mark Olly, a great guy and a writer, author, and everything, musician. But I wanted to ask you. You said something like Arthur was a knight and he was a warrior. He never became king. He never.
No. In the early records, he's a dux bellorum. Now, a Duke of Battles it's kind of like a late Roman title for a general, if you like. There's a good chance the king actually was Melgwyn Gwynedd, who's one of the Welsh kings. He was probably Arthur's boss. Certainly at the start he would have been, but Arthur was just like the top of the tree, if you like, of warriors. He's a tribal warrior leader, and he leads all of the people under him in the style of a Roman military commander, and that's basically what he is. He's never referred to in the early records as a king. The king thing is a medieval add-on.
You were saying that an invading foreign power, unsympathetic to the truth and seeking to subvert and overthrow a long and ancient existing regime. They were involved in disinformation or misinformation, right, Mark?
Yeah. Let me read that. I'll just pop my glasses on. That's okay. Important, actually. That does appear on the back of the book. It's quite important. The reason is, Merlin. This is that bit. It says Merlin becomes one of an ancient line of Pythagorean scholars and political visionaries, which is what he was. Joseph of Arimathea is a religious dissident fleeing persecution and death to far off foreign shores because he's trying to escape from the Romans because they're out to get him. And then Arthur is a hardened, womanizing battle leader who loses his entire family and culture to war and then eventually to natural disaster. So the characters they're real characters. They're real. They speak to us in the 21st century. They have very similar issues, if you like, to people alive on the planet today.
Mark, are we talking about the same Joseph of Arimathea?
Yeah, Joseph
from the Jesus time.
Yes, yeah, he's. Well,
that was about 50 AD.
Yeah. What you've got to do, the way it runs in chronological order, is Merlin basically is, if you like, the last survivor of a druid order. Merlin is a title. I've got about 6 of them running in order, but the one we're talking about here is the second and the third. Those 2 Merlins are alive at the time when Arthur's alive. But the druids, the actual druids and the background to Merlin, that goes all the way back into the Bronze Age. They were around an enormously long amount of time. So that's why we start with Merlin, because we start with that background to that ancient religion, and it fills you in with the background. Then all of a sudden, the next thing to come along, once you go from BC to AD, the next thing chronologically is Christianity. Christianity arrives. So then you've got this kind of merger, if you like, of what's happening in early Christianity with what's happening as the Druid religion starts to fade. It becomes Christianized. And you have to understand that. So Joseph is, if you like, the peg to hang that one on. So when you look at Joseph is the origins of the Holy Grail. Now, you can't do Arthur without dealing with the Holy Grail. So actually the Holy Grail comes in fairly early in the book. It arrives fairly early with Joseph. So then you actually get Merlin himself is the next bit where he's then interacting with Arthur, and Arthur comes along. So you've got a merger of all of that information coming together. So although chronologically it looks a bit bonkers to be sort of jumping around, Merlin has the oldest running background, if you like, the oldest religious background. Then along comes Joseph, and he's the representation of the new religion, the newly emerging religion. And then along comes Arthur, and he has to deal with this. He has to swallow all of this history up. So by the time you hit Arthur, you've actually got a good idea of where Arthur was coming from. It gives you Arthur's background, you know, it gives you socially, religious wise, structurally, you know, as far as the Romans are concerned. Once you look at that, the first chapter's Merlin, the next chapter's Joseph, the next chapter's Arthur. So it gives you the background that you need then to deal with the stories of Arthur. If you think about it logically, most people start with the medieval stuff and then try and work backwards. Well, right. in a sense, you're on a hiding to nowhere, because you've already destroyed the information, because you're coming from a totally fictitious later viewpoint. So to do it by coming from the earliest, coming towards us from the earliest material heading that way, it makes perfect sense. A friend of mine's just finished reading the book actually, and he says exactly the same thing. He says the fact that it runs in chronological order makes it actually quite an easy read, because you can get through all this information, and the dates are down the left hand side of the page, so you always know where you are, and you can see how the next step follows the previous step, which is, you know, it's a logical way to approach something.
Yeah, Mark, you mentioned the Druids, and here in the U.S., we hear stories about the Druids, and a lot of people are there magical people, and that's where Merlin come from the Druids. Mark, is he magical? How magical was he?
He's well, if you imagine somebody that has, you know, thousands of years of knowledge and education, the Druids back then were essentially Greek. Through the Roman period, they kind of followed Pythagoras, which is, you know, a great philosopher and mathematician. So they followed the Greek philosophers, and they said, the Romans actually said, if you want to learn about Druids, you want to learn about Druidry, you come to Britain. You know, they're all over the world, Druids, but if you really want to become a Druid, a proper Druid, you train here in the British Isles. So it's a uniquely British religion at its core, at its source. So if you imagine these, you've got these guys wandering around, you know, and it's like having, you know, 10,000 Leonardo da Vinci's all in one. You know, they've got science, they've got, you know, astrology, astronomy, they've got medicine, they've got herbs, they've got philosophy, you know, they've got all of this, you know, thousands of years of past technology behind them. They're going to appear like magicians. They're going to be able to stand there in a stone circle and go, right, I know which direction I'm facing now. And guess what? There's going to be an eclipse over there in 10 minutes, you know, bam, the whole place goes black. You know, they're going to look like magical people. You know, if they can levitate stones, if they can, you know, build machines to do jobs, whatever the super technology was that they had back then, they could do it. You know, they had an ability to do that. The Romans really didn't like them, because they were the only real hardcore, solid, you know, ancient religion to stand up to the Romans. They didn't like the Romans, because the Romans are, at the end of the day, they're thieves. You know, the Romans just stole everything from other cultures. They were brutes. Yeah, you know, archaeologists, we know that that's what they did. They just nicked everything to form this super empire. So yeah, the Druids, you know, never stopped fighting the Romans. Then again, neither did the Christians. So you can kind of see how there was a kind of a merger going on here in Britain to form the beginnings of the Celtic Church. When you get into the Celtic Christianity side of it, wow, you just blow your mind.
No, I don't want to say King Arthur. I just want to say Arthur.
Yeah, he's always been Arthur.
Yeah, but also, now, were they tied in with Stonehenge? These were the Druids, right? They were tied in with Stonehenge.
You can do it. You can do it backwards. You can kind of go backwards and say the technology that was involved in building something like Stonehenge and the knowledge behind it. Yes, that was encapsulated. That survived into later times with Druids, and then ultimately with the Chaldees. They all had the last of that knowledge. So he's connected in that sense. But, you know, is it the Giant's Dance? You know, did he fly the blocks over to Salisbury Plain from Ireland? You know, and no, that's not the reality of it. The actual Giant's Dance, like I say, it's at Ceredigion, which is in North Wales. It's not too far from Bala Lake. We've got all these big piles of volcanic rock on this limestone outcrop. They seem to be the monument that was created by Merlin. Plus the fact he's buried on the mountain next door. That's where his grave site is. So we've got an actual site where it looks like that's where the legend began. You blame Geoffrey of Monmouth and all the writers, the medieval writers, for connecting Stonehenge.
Now,
really.
Joseph of Arimathea was probably gone before Arthur or even Merlin come along.
Yes.
How did he influence this story that you had on the tree?
Well, once you know what's going on in this country as far as the Druids are concerned, and you realise this country is quite unique in Roman terms, it has very much its own identity. Back in the Holy Land, when you've got the crucifixion and all that going on, there were a string of emperors immediately around the time of the crucifixion and immediately afterwards who really didn't like the Christians. They really did not want that religion to take off. The worst of them, the famous one, is Nero, who burnt Rome and blamed it on the Christians. So when you realize just how far the Romans were going to try and get rid of them, Joseph basically sets off and decides to get as far away from Rome and the Romans as he possibly can. Well, the furthest you could go then was Britain. If you went any further, you fell into the Atlantic. You know what I mean? This was as far as you could go within the Roman Empire. And that's why he ends up over here. But he brings with him some really crucially important people. There's at least one, possibly two, maybe even 3 or 4 Marys that come with him. It could be Mary, the mother of God, Mary, Jesus' mother. Mary Magdalene could be one of them. You got all the Black Madonnas and all this. So that could very well be the Ethiopian handmaiden, who was a Mary. And he brings all these followers, and he starts the first church outside of the Judaic one, which is in Jerusalem. He starts the first church here around about 52 to 54 AD. Now what's interesting is if you go knock on the Pope's door and you say to the Pope, what's the oldest church on planet Earth, he will tell you it's the Celtic Church, because it's officially recognized that that's when Joseph founded the Celtic Chaldee church here in Britain. The Roman Catholic one is Peter and Paul, and that's 60 to 62 AD. That's later. So when you start looking at these firsts, you start realizing the connections that whole Christianity has to here. That gives you the background then to how powerfully Arthur is trying to find relics later on. He goes in search of things like the Holy Grail, the lance, the true cross. He's looking for all of these things because actually a lot of them end up here. It's interesting actually, because Joseph's Grail that Arthur would have looked for would have been 2 containers, 2 glass cruets, one with the sweat of Christ and one with the blood of Christ. That's featured on the cover actually. You've got the 2 cruets. That's what Joseph is said to have brought here as his Grail. And it's really interesting because if you could find those, you'd have God's DNA.
Scientists have a hard time describing the Grail, what the Grail really is. And also, Mark, there's a story that I've been hearing about Mary Magdalene. She landed in the south of France.
Yes.
And they have churches there named after her. And she had a little girl. She had a daughter. Now, I don't know if you go in that deep about it, but you're talking about the beginning of the church. And I think Mary Magdalene started the church in south of France. And then Joseph, he went to England.
He continued on to get to here. Yeah.
They split apart so they wouldn't be found, right?
Yeah, well, that essentially is the core, if you like, of that part of the legend. But once you know that, once you've got that piece of information, when you reach King Arthur, Arthur's 350 years, 400 years later. Once you get to him, you've then got the same background that he had. Do you see how it makes sense? And then all these searches for different things and the Grail and where he went and what he did, suddenly it starts to make sense because you've got that background information. The background information on Joseph is incredibly hard to find. It's really difficult. A lot of it's in the Vatican Library. There's ancient manuscripts that you're dealing with. So an awful lot of the background that I've got in the book is something that you probably won't find anywhere else.
And you can't get into the Vatican Library. That's very secure. But it's interesting how you're tying. I'm trying to delineate how you're tying in Merlin, Joseph, and Arthur all in this, and you're doing a great job with it. I mean, because Joseph was much earlier, and then you have can we talked about Arthur. Everybody's really mystified about Merlin. He's a magician. He raised the stones of Stonehenge. That's
Yeah.
what we hear in the U.S.
Yeah.
In UK it may teach it differently. You guys may have a truer sense of history, your own history, than we have been getting here in the U.S. So, Mark, could you tell us about that?
Well, yeah, I would encourage people in America to buy the book because it becomes very obvious very quickly that Merlin is a title. So there's a very famous Welsh bard called Taliesin. Over here, everybody knows about Taliesin and the poems of Taliesin, the works of Taliesin. He was alive in around about 420, 430 AD. He's referred to as the first Merlin. His name is Merlin Taliesin. Then you get into the generation before Arthur, because you've got Uther Pendragon, that is Arthur's dad, but Uther has a brother called Ambrosius. Now, Ambrosius was less of a battle leader. He was more of a politician, and he was more religious, and he was more of a reformer. He's referred to as Merlin Ambrosius. So there's your second Merlin. Then you've got this guy, Merlin le Logan. That's Welsh for dear friend. He is with Arthur when Arthur begins doing what Arthur does. That's the Merlin everybody thinks of, because he lived to be about 100 plus, 103, I think he was when he died. But he's only with Arthur up to the Battle of Badon. So he sees Arthur reinstating all of the Roman Empire and conquering and bringing back freedom for Druidry, freedom for Christianity, etc. Up to Badon, fabulous. Then he dies. So you get a different Merlin then. You get this Merlin Willett, Merlin the Mad, Merlin of the Woods. He then comes into play, and he's with Arthur in Arthur's years of decline. So he actually is the Merlin that sees everything go wrong. He sees the Britons turn on each other. He sees civil war. He sees the Anglo-Saxons beginning to win. It all goes horribly wrong. He lives to be about 80 odd, but he goes mad. He goes slowly mad and ends up being this crazy mad man that lives in the woods. There is another Merlin after him called Merlin Tortugan, who is then in Cumbria and the lowlands of Scotland. And he's a bard. He's a poet. And then the Anglo-Saxons kind of bring that whole Merlin order to an end. So you've got 200 years of Merlins in the 4th and 5th century. But by the 6th century, they're gone. The Anglo-Saxons have wiped them out. And when you start looking at the identity of all these different people, I mean, there's loads of material in the book.
Your book sounds exciting, because we only know of one Merlin, and you told us about 3 of them.
Well, there's 6 in that list, and 2 of them in Arthur's lifetime.
Wow.
But they're all very important people. They're very specific people, and any material that can be attributed to them. So if you can trace back to, Taliesin or whatever, that material is in the book. So you can actually read things that are attributed to them, and it gives you an identity, gives you an idea of what these people were like.
Mark, which Merlin was the most fantastic? The one that we're doing movies about?
Yeah, it's Merlin le Logan. It's Merlin 1. I've got a Merlin 1 and a Merlin 2, which are either side of Arthur, and it's that Merlin 1, Merlin dear friend. I mean, he's born at a time when the Romans are still here. He's born in the 400s, so he sees the Romans leave Britain, and he sees the decline of the Roman Empire, and he tries to bring it back. And he's an enormously powerful, intelligent, long-lived individual. I mean, to get past 100 in the Dark Ages, is a colossal age, and to have that as an advisor, Arthur must have been privileged to have him, and he was Arthur's strength. Arthur as a rise to prominence, you can see where Merlin plays a part in that, because the pair of them are tremendously strong together. But then as soon as it gets past the Battle of Badon, and this older Merlin dies, so he then has to turn to a younger one. That's when Arthur starts to go off the rails as well, because he hasn't got an advisor who is as good. He's just got somebody of his own age, his own generation. And you can see that coming out clearly in the story.
Wow, you've done some research. Writing is a lot of work, and what you've done, and you put this together after 40 years, and getting into this stuff. All we see is Merlin and King Arthur, the Round Table, and we see the movies, and we see the sword and the stone. And you talked about the stone being a beheading stone, and it's not actually where the sword was buried. Did Merlin?
Well, there was a sword in the stone, but what they used to do was cast the bronze swords of office in stone molds. Okay. So actually there was a sword, and it was made of bronze. It did shine and it flashed, and it was pulled out of a stone, but it was pulled out of a stone mold. And if you think about it logically, if you're a Roman, soldier and you're fighting, you're not going to go into battle with a great big piece of bronze, because the first time you hit an iron sword, your bronze sword is going to fall apart. It's a ceremonial sword. It's part of the Bronze Age. It's a Bronze Age ritual sword. It's a later copy of an earlier type of sword. Arthur actually had 2 iron swords, and this is where you get a bit of a shocker, really, because in the days of the Crusades, when Richard the Lionheart went out to Jerusalem, he donated one of those iron swords to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So knocking around in a cupboard somewhere in that church is one of Arthur's swords.
Really?
I'm going to phone.
And we don't know about it.
Well, they probably don't know about it. I'm probably going to phone them up one day when I'm doing research for TV programs and go, "Hi, have you got a big rusty piece of metal stuck in one of your cupboards? You're not going to believe this, but that's the sword of Arthur, and that's where it's supposed to be."
There's so much that we don't know about history, and I appreciate you're taking a really different look at this. And we understand like Merlin and Arthur, and we understand Joseph being back in Jesus' time, and he just played that part. But we don't understand where he went from there, and you're explaining that, and that's great.
Yeah, there's a whole chapter in the book that just deals with what happens after Arthur, because obviously when he dies, his legend just goes bonkers. It goes global, and I try and trace as many of the artifacts associated with Arthur as I can. I do the same thing with the Grail and with a lot of the other relics. I kind of trace them to find out where they went. So that's an adventure. Chapter 4 is an adventure all in itself. After Arthur.
Well, you talked about the sword being molded into stone. Are we talking about cement, that they put together cement and poured it in there?
No, what they used to do is, if you wanted to make a sword, you would find some really hard stone. So let's say you're looking at probably basalt or granite or something like that. You'd decide what shape you wanted the sword to be. You'd split the stone and you'd put 2 halves of a mold into which you could pour liquid metal. So you'd then put the 2 halves together. You'd pour the liquid metal into the top, and then the sword would obviously pop and fizz, and you'd see all this bronze metal, heated metal going in, and these 2 molds would be strapped together all the way down. When that's gone hard, you would then have to chisel into the joint, and it would fall apart, revealing the sword, and there's the sword stuck in. And at that point, very often, whoever was the druid master at the time, because obviously it's alchemy to the average person to see all this happening, whoever was there would pull that sword out and name it. So as far as we know from the Welsh records, Merlin was the one to pull it out, and he actually called it Calderbolg, which means flashing one, the flashing sword, which is where you get the caliber bit in Excalibur.
Right.
It's a nod to, a later nod to Calderbolg, which is the original sword. But actual Excalibur would have been iron. It's a different sword.
So Excalibur is a type of iron, and we use it as a name in movies. We've had people named Excalibur, I guess, in movies, but it makes for a lot of sci-fi. I guess you talk about Merlin. Now, I know we talked about this Merlin being magical, but was there anything really true about any of his mystical things that he's done? Anything in the history?
Well, there's absolutely no doubt that druidry, and all of the technology that we associate and everything that we know about the Bronze Age and about the Greeks and about the Romans, and about all the other, technologies around the planet, that particular branch of druidry, of which Merlin was a part, that had probably 4,000 years of development to arrive at that point. So if you start to then put in religion, you put in your alchemy, you put in your astrology, your ability to predict from signs and seasons and birds and all the rest of it, you put in all those kind of elements as well, then he must have been an absolutely super guy. Because when you start looking at something like Christianity, that's only had 2,000 years to develop. It's only 2,000 years old. Well, he was the last of an order. That he was the kind of head, if you like, of a system that had been around 4,000 years. That's awesome. That is absolutely almighty. And even the word druid, it comes from druvida, which is Sanskrit. So there's an awful lot of connections to the druids that appear to come from the East. So we're not even getting into what he might have known that came from Iran and Iraq and Turkey and even further, China, Japan. We don't know. We just don't know how far the Druids stretched and what they knew, what technology they had. So in terms of real magic, genuine magic, being able to actually do things that nobody else would have been able to do, he had that. But then he also must have had an enormous spiritual dimension to what he did. So you can't kind of throw out the baby with the bathwater. It's not something you can dodge. You can't have him as just being a scientist. He was, a super scientist, but he was also super religious at the same time. And then on top of that, of course, depending on what you believe, Jesus comes down, which means we get a visit from God, bang, we've got a new religion. The new religion comes over. By the time Merlin's around, he's dealing with that as well. He's coping with all that as well. If you'd have bumped into Merlin in, say, 450 AD in North Wales and said, where's Joseph buried? He'd have gone, oh, he's down there. He's in Valley Crucis Abbey near Llangollen. That's where he is. He's in the middle of there. He'd have took you and showed you the grave where he was, because that's how close, they are relatively. It's only like from sort of here to the 1700s, it's only that kind of distance. So like we've still got lots of remains over here from the Industrial Revolution, and the English Civil War. We've still got loads of archaeology and physical remains. That kind of thing was going on in the past. Camelot, for example, is Chester. If you look at the Roman city of Chester, the Roman buildings that were in there were still standing when the Normans came along 1,000 years, 1,500 years after Arthur. You could ride into Chester through the Almighty Gates. You would see the White City of God, Camelot, Arthur's city. The Round Table, which in reality was Tabulus Rotundus, was the round floor, the building that contained that, would still have been standing. So there's good old William the Conqueror, after 1066 and all that. And he's, 1072, he comes riding into Chester, and people in Chester are going, yep, this is where Arthur was. There's his palace. There's the Round Table. There's the shrines of the martyrs. They're all still there. It's only in the last 1,000 years that we've lost all this. These things have collapsed and been demolished and they've vanished. But at the time of Geoffrey Monmouth, Geoffrey had a lot of connections to Wales. He got a lot of material out the library at Bangor. Well, if he wanted to know what was going on, he should have known better. He could have just gone to Chester and had a look. It was all there. So when you start, this is the effect of chronology. When you start to look at things in historical order, which the book does, it kind of unravels all the nonsense. It picks all the nonsense apart, but at the same time, it puts all the truth together. It starts to build the truth. Just piece of trivia, like while we're on the subject of William the Conqueror, you have a look at the famous Bayeux Tapestry, which is, the life of William the Conqueror and his conquest of Britain. Right. And blow me if there's not a round table on there. There's an actual round table. It's William the Conqueror. He sat there at a round table. So that's where that idea came from. You're seeing these things, these connections, archetypes and images. Well, that's because they were all still there. He had references he could go back to.
Right. That's just like religions. A lot of things come from ancient Egypt. A lot of the ideas come from there. Yeah, they passed down. I know you studied that. But we're getting back into this Merlin and then Philip Mandel. Let's bring this back in. But Merlin was not an ET, right?
No. There was a great tendency, especially in the 1960s and 70s, to look at the Arthurian legends and to say, was Arthur, for example, a solar god? Did Arthur come from somewhere else? Is he an actual archetype of, something that's much older, much more ancient? And again, the same trend has gone in the direction of the Merlins, to look at the Merlins and say, are they archetypal? Are they a representation, or are they, an actual physical form of something that's much older? Now, in the book, I pretty much discard that, because what I'm after as an archaeologist, I'm trying to find out what they were like at the time. I'm digging back through the layers of nonsense, if you like, getting further and further back in time. That's not how they saw themselves. That wouldn't have been something they would have really attributed to themselves. That having been said, if there was stuff whizzing about in the sky, Merlin would have known about it. It's not out of the question. And he would have had perhaps the same kind of questions about the fact that this country and a lot of other countries are just covered in circles. They're covered in stone circles. And there are sites that possibly in his day that he would have found equally difficult to explain. You know, if he was aware, for example, of the 600-ton blocks that are halfway up the temple platform at Baalbek, he might have looked at that and thought, well, yeah, I'm going to have to do a bit of research here. I'm not really sure how that got up there, So they would have dealt with very much the same kind of things we're dealing with now. So it doesn't rule out the possibility that in ancient times there were signs in the heavens, things appeared, things, it's there. Actually, I do mention a comet and a few other things that appear in the book, but at no point is there a direct ufological connection. You can't.
Medieval art, they have actually like a flying saucer in a couple of
yes, they do.
artworks.
Yes, they do. Yeah.
And so that's where these ideas come from.
Yeah.
And with Merlin, and I know that a lot of this has made a lot of good stories, like the Holy Grail you brought up a while ago, Joseph having two vials, one of sweat, one of blood.
Yeah.
And that was the Grail. But then some scientists are saying the Holy Grail was actually the daughter of Jesus Christ, and Mary Magdalene took her to southern France.
Yeah, so, that's a tough one because that is a modern day legend that has only existed for maybe 60 or 80 years at the most. And what they've done is they've gone back and they've taken a lot of the older elements from the previous 1,000 years and kind of merged them all together to try and come up with that. But if you actually go back to the preceding 1,000 years, so you're going back 2,000 years, it's very difficult to substantiate that as a viewpoint. There are, believe it or not, 27 different varieties of Grail in my book, but surprisingly enough, Mary isn't one of them. No, she's not one of them. The womb that produced Christ, she's not strictly speaking a Grail. She can't, strictly speaking, be referred to as a Grail. The two things that seem to have generated all of the important artifacts that were searched for are the Last Supper and the crucifixion. So if you've got artifacts or items or religious philosophy, religious theology that's associated with either the crucifixion or the Last Supper, that's Grail territory. You're firmly on Grail territory with that. Once you get off that, who knows where it's coming from? It's very difficult to track that.
Let me ask you a question about some of this history back in southern France and even in Spain. And in Europe, you have the Knights Templar.
Yes.
Were any of those involved with any of these movements, like with Merlin and Arthur, or any of them?
Yeah, I can categorically say yes. There was an entire order of Grail Knights. They started at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre at the time of the Crusades. So at the same time, all of these knightly orders were forming, if you like, the Templars, the Hospitallers, the Knights of Christ, the Knights of Lazarus, all of them. They all start in Jerusalem at the time of the First Crusade. Well, it's almost certain that the order of the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre, and more specifically the Templars, were responsible for bringing 2 stone cups from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to Spain. They are referred to in the old records as Ruminis, and they are the transporters, if you like, the guardians of the Grail to get it across into Europe at the time of the Crusades. That's actually covered. There is actual physical evidence of that happening. It's covered in the book because back in around about, I think it was 2011 or 2012, some guys were going through some Islamic manuscripts in the Middle East, and you're not going to believe this, but they came up with the shipping receipts for the Grail.
Really? Yeah.
They found them. They actually found the shipping receipts for the Grail. Apparently Saladin took a lot of interest in it as well. So there's connections there to the world of Islam. But it's only when you go over there and you actually start reading the Islamic manuscripts that you suddenly find that's where the answer is to where the physical cups went. That's where they ended up. I think it's the Chalice of San Isidoro is one of them, and there's another one out there that are these 2 cups. One's a cup of the Apostles, and the other one's a cup of Christ. And they finish up out in Spain. They're still there to this day. So if you physically want those 2 Grails, you can go and find them. I just stopped short of putting the actual address in the book. You can just go check them on the internet. There's loads of photos on the internet. You'll be able to go and find them. But there is actual background. You're dealing with historical documentation here that supports them. So yeah, the book, the thing that used to annoy me about books, especially about King Arthur, is you've got sword this and Grail that, and Holy Cross this and Camelot this and Round Table that, and you read all the books and you think, where are they? That's what the public asks this. That's the first question you ask is, if these things exist or existed, what happened to them? Where did they go?
What about the ancient libraries in Greek that was burned down, and also the library in Alexandria was burned down?
Well,
because of religious differences, Mark. Did a lot of that, I guess, go up in flames? A lot of history.
Yes, that's the broad sweep of the brush, if you like, because yes, that happens all the time. We lose so much history that way. But in Arthurian terms, it's been the British royal and political structure over the years that have caused successive chunks, if you like, of the Arthurian cycle to either disappear or vanish into private libraries and become inaccessible. So there's a bit of a conspiracy there. I do cover that in the book. The last chapter has got a whole section there just called conspiracy, and it kind of tells you how we ended up in this mess.
I wanted to ask you a question about Arthur before I go into this other statement that you have here. Arthur, he was how old when he died, and how did he die in battle?
Yeah, it's a really sad story, actually. By the time he dies, he had 7 sons, and there's only one of them left alive at the end of his life, and that's Mordred. There's a whole backstory just to Mordred. He was the son that Arthur basically pushed away very early on. So there was a real hatred between the two of them. So if you read the book, there's this massive build-up, to this final conflict. Mordred basically, in Arthur's absence, Mordred gets this whole army of Saxons and Danes and people that don't like Arthur. He builds his own army, and Arthur comes back then with his army from fighting on the continent, and he's got this Romano-British army that's mostly made up of Britons, and the pair of them actually meet at the Battle of Camlan. Now, Camlan still exists. It's Arfon Gamlan in Wales. You can go and stand on the battlefield, literally. I absolutely pinpoint that one. And they have this massive battle, and eventually literally everybody is killed. And Arthur eventually takes this blow from Mordred's spear. Now, it's Saxon style because the Saxons poisoned their weapons. So this spear doesn't actually kill Arthur, but it gives him blood poisoning. So he effectively dies. He passes away about 3 days or so after the battle. So everybody's wiped out. The only people that are left there's a couple of warriors, the person that writes the story, and another bard. There's Bedivere. So Bedivere survives. He's the only knight. Arthur, and then 1 or 2 of the people from the baggage train. So there's enough people to get him back, and they get him all the way back to a hill fort in North Wales, which is Innisfalloch, which is Avalon. They try and treat his injuries there, and when they realise that he can't be treated, they put him on a boat and sail him to the centre of the area known as Avalon. Where he's taken to a small chapel. They have a service for him. By that point, it would appear that he's physically dead. But he gets collected. He actually gets collected from there by the Druids, and he gets buried in an old Druidical way. So although the service for him is Christian, his burial is Druidical. And that's where it gets interesting, because then from that point, you've got to try and trace where he ultimately gets buried. Now, that record was lost, completely lost. Nobody has a foggiest idea where he ended up.
Do you think it's intentionally somebody lost it?
No, there's a big he dies in 539, and then there's a big volcanic eruption. Krakatoa goes up in 542. David Keyes wrote an amazing book called Catastrophe, and that covers it. That causes absolute mayhem. There's asteroids, there's meteorites, there's earthquakes, volcanic eruptions all over the planet. There's fallout. They think there was like a nuclear winter for 3 years. By the time they pull out of that, they haven't got a clue where he is. They haven't got the foggiest idea, because nothing survives. That is the catastrophe, the cataclysm, really, that just puts the blanket over it. So you got the Welsh going, well, you know what? He's not dead. He's going to come back. He's going to rise from the dead in Britain's greatest hour of need, and all this. And then you got the English going, no, I'm sorry. We think he's dead. He's gone. That's it. You're not going to get a battle leader back.
Yeah, you mentioned Camelot a while ago, Mark, and Camelot was real, and you mentioned So we had John F. Kennedy, and his political career. They they said that that was Camelot for us here in the U.S. I
Yeah.
don't know why they were calling, the John F. Kennedy and his family the Camelot. The family. Is there any distinction there between the two?
I can understand the parallels. I mean, academically, like I say, Arthur was a super duper leader, died before his time, died far too young. All his family died. It was almost like he was cursed.
Mhm.
Didn't work out well. When you start looking into Arthur's background, militarily, not particularly good. Politics, not particularly good. His times, his equivalent, if you like, to what was happening with JFK, you can definitely see, equivalents there. Camelot is a location, it's a place.
Right.
And what happened over here is that they tried to get rid of Camelot because it's not London. Everybody over here is obsessed with London being the capital city of Britain. Well, that's another one of these big, nuclear bombshells. It wasn't the capital for the Romans. For the Romans, Chester was the capital. And they've spent 2,000 years trying to bury that as a fact. Well, possibly with the Kennedys, you could argue that wherever they were, then that was the capital of American society. That, they were, as it were, the birth of a new era. They brought in new historical times. So their times you could view as being like the center of everything that was going on. Subsequent to them going, a lot of that's been lost. It's disappeared. People brushed it under the carpet. So there are parallels, and I can understand that people who have studied both academically would see parallels.
Mark, that's a great explanation. Thank you. I didn't know I was going to get that good of an explanation on this.
Because that's not in the book,
It's just hard to draw parallels because you mentioned Camelot. That's in your book. But Saxons, Danes, and Vikings, and everybody's interested in the Vikings. What this Arthurian context? The Vikings were, I guess, followed some of that religious.
I'll give you an interesting story because it's a fabulous story. It's a lovely connection, and it concerns the Grail. Basically, you've got Arthur dying in, let's say, before 550. He dies in 539, so he's dead by the middle of the 500s. He's gone. So the Danes come in, and the Saxons come in. Actually, they're in the 700s. Then you got the Danes coming in there around about the end of the 700s, beginning of the 800s. The Vikings have started coming in on the back of them as well. So the Vikings get here, and most of the Vikings are here in the 800s in this country, going into the 900s. By the time they get here, the Saxons have tried to get rid of him. They've tried to do away with Arthur because he was their enemy. So they've tried to forget him. But the Welsh haven't. And the Vikings, it's like the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So all of a sudden, the Vikings are getting on really well with the Welsh, and they're talking to each other. Now, the Vikings have got this culture where they create heroes out of warriors, things like Beowulf and all that. So as soon as the Vikings get this idea that there's this character called Arthur, they're like, oh, yeah, I like this. We can start, telling tales. We can tell stories about Arthur. So by the time you get it from the 900s into the 1000s, the Vikings are just the Normans. So the Normans are the same as the Vikings. So where you see this word Norman, just read Viking. So all of a sudden, Geoffrey of Monmouth, who wrote the history of the kings of the Britons and all that, he's of Norman descent, is basically they're Vikings. So what the Normans are doing, they're taking material that they're aware of as Vikings and they're reworking it. So actually the entire Arthurian cycle, all of the stuff we've got that's medieval Arthur, has been reinvented and reworked by Vikings, late era Vikings. And this is where it gets really interesting, because the words sangral, they're Viking.
Really?
Graal comes from the same root word as gruel and things like that. So it's a porridge. It's a type of porridge made from grain served in a stone bowl. And san in Viking just means the in capital letters. So when you're looking for the Grail, you're looking for that chalice that Christ had on, at the Last Supper. But a graal, a sangral, can also be a stone serving bowl that used to feed Vikings on a Viking ship. That's where that word comes from, which is why you don't hear the word Grail. It never gets used until medieval times, because it's a Viking world. Well, and if you think about it logically, the bread and the wine, it's grain and grape. So what they used to do was they used to make porridge out of grain and flavor it with wine. Yeah. So it's the same. It's just the Viking version of a Judaic Christian archetype.
Can you imagine we're at the end of this hour and it goes so fast.
Wow.
Mark, tell everybody where they can get your books again. And this is episode 2 we're finishing up, and he's on episode 1 talking about the other book that he had about
Crystal Skulls and Human
Crystal
Heads is
Skulls.
on 1. Yeah.
And so this one here has been fantastic. What a great history lesson.
Thank you. Well, if you want to get the Polychronicon of Merlin, Joseph, and Arthur, the best thing you can do, anything to do with me or any of my books, head for Amazon. Go to Amazon. Everything's on Amazon. All the books are there. Find the book.
Facebook.
Yeah, it's the click. Pay, click into your basket, and a few days later, it's through your door.
And you can
you
find
it
yourself on Facebook too. And
me,
Mark Olly,
Facebook.
great talking to you. Had fun, fellow musician, talented guy. This has been the Dave Emmons Show. Thank you for joining us, and good evening or good afternoon.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Mark.